I guess I need to talk into the mic for the camera, right? Okay, yeah, no problem. Okay, so my name is Adam. Uh, my background really quickly is from the music world, not the visual art world. I played guitar and played a lot of rock and jazz, and then later improv, and then got into contemporary music composition through improv music. And I stopped playing completely at that point and just wrote a lot of music, chamber music, often involving electronics, a lot of electroacoustic, live electronics kind of projects. And at a certain point, I started to want to do things outside of the concert world. I was trying to explore some ideas about space, about sound, about listening, in a way that that wasn't using these very established codes we have in music. Even in experimental music, we're still using this kind of form of presentation that has a history, has its baggage, which gives us a great advantage in certain aspects, and but I felt it was restricting me a little bit. So I started making more and more installations like the one you saw downstairs. So I'll talk a little bit about that piece and a little bit about why I'm using feedback and why I'm making installations. And I'll show you some other work too that hopefully relates somewhat to what you saw downstairs. And because it's like a small, intimate group, even though I'm talking to a microphone, if there's a question like in the middle, just like raise your hand or something, and like we can tackle it right there. But I will leave some time for questions at the end too. I guess one thing that really interested me going into installations, and it was sort of a slow transition, was that at some point I got it in my head that I really wanted to compose with stuff that's not sound. Not on its own. I wanted to create some sort of combination between sound, certain sort of formal temporal articulation of sound, like we think about in music, alongside something else that's not sounding, but I wanted to treat it with the same kind of some of the same formal tools that I learned as a composer. And actually, I sort of, for a long time, and I sort of do think about the relationship between the sonic and non-sonic in my work as a form of harmony or orchestration. So that was an idea that was really interesting to me. And as I've done more and more work, I'm really trying to incorporate these kind of sound structures with some sort of concept or some sort of idea or textual material or visual material in a way that creates a combination between the two and gives us something that neither media on its own would sort of get us to the same point. Yeah, that's all I want to say about that. So this is you'll see the rest of this piece. I'm just kind of teasing you with a few images, but a lot of my work revolves around the idea of unpacking listening. Listening as an activity is just something that I find really fascinating, because the more you think about it, you realize that listening it's not just something that happens in your ear or even your brain, but it's so distributed, it's active, it's something that we frame conceptually. Of course, like you can listen to something as music, or you can listen to something as an annoying noise, and it could be the same material, but it's your framing of the issue or how the sound is being framed that really collaborates with the sonic material that we're experiencing. And I'm really interested in the relationship between human and non-human agencies in the construction of listening as this kind of distributed process. So, for instance, the materiality of the microphone the acoustics of the room, what you ate for breakfast. All these things are coming together to create the sonic experience that we're sharing right now, and yet it's individual for each person. So a lot of the work that I've done in the last year is actually really playing on this idea of materiality, partially because of the tools that I'm using, microphones, speakers. You'll see a little bit later there are some other objects, cassette tape machines, earplugs, headphones, stuff like that. And the idea is to kind of, on the one hand, play with a technical vocabulary. We all have, even if you're not a sound engineer, you have a basic understanding of how a microphone and a speaker work functionally. The microphone has to be plugged into something and the sound will go into it and will come out of a speaker. We have a general understanding of these kind of ideas. So I try to create work that's almost a diagram of itself that kind of reveals in one way how it's being produced while hiding other parts of itself. And I think these things, microphones, speakers, they're really interesting materials because they're kind of modeled on our bodily apparatuses of sound making and of sound perceiving or listening. So they're this kind of very crude copy of some of our some of the things we have. And take care of your ears. It's like the best microphone you'll ever own. But then they kind of like stand outside of our bodies. So like they're kind of like prosthetics for listening, technological prosthetics. And I think it's interesting to use these tools which are modeled on our own listening as ways to explore our own listening. There's kind of a circularity in it that I really like, and nonsensical circularity is something that I use a lot in my work, not just in feedback, but just in general as an idea. And I like the idea that maybe understanding listening, like in this image, you have a microphone and a PA system and a speaker, and they're hooked up together. We can think of it as a listening system by exploring what it means for a machine or a technical assemblage to listen. What does it mean for it to listen? We are forced to kind of reflect on what it means for ourselves to listen. And that's kind of how I got into feedbacks, and I'll follow up on that thought. So the piece that you saw downstairs, and you heard downstairs, and I do recommend to go back, not in an opening setting. It's called A Room Listening to Itself. It's part of a series of works that I call it loosely The Sound of Empty Space. So they're all works that use feedback as the only sound-making technique. So it's all live amplification, what you heard downstairs. There's no recordings, there's no synthesis. It's just microphones and speakers working exactly as they would in any other context, with a few differences. But there's no modification to the microphones or speakers. And the idea of the sound of empty space comes from thinking about amplification in general. Like everything uses amplification today. Like your phone uses amplification, of course, microphones, speakers, when we listen to music. It's really ubiquitous, but there is this kind of power dynamic that's created through amplification. And that goes, dates back a lot further than electronic amplification. If you look at like architecture of a church, it's amplifying the person talking and giving the sermon. So this is a really, really old idea. And it creates this power dynamic. I'm talking into the microphone, you are listening to me. It's being recorded, and that will be amplified somewhere else. So I have a much wider reach than you do right now. I can be a lot louder than you can be right now. And there is a sense that the microphone is pointed at something important, right? There's a sense that, in fact, having the microphone pointing at me is making me more important than I would be otherwise. If I was, talking with less sense than I am right now, it would still give the aura of importance, because otherwise, why would you amplify it, right? So I'm very interested in this dynamic and in inverting it in some way. And for me, this idea, going back maybe to the last image of a microphone pointing at a speaker, there's this nonsensical sense about it, where you are short-circuiting the system and you're not allowing it to enact the normative dynamics that you would otherwise. And the idea of empty space for me, it's not thinking of a vacuum, for instance, right? It's thinking of a space that's empty of content, a space that's not, it's not an instrument, and it's not some sort of text that is both sanctioned and sanctified by the act of amplification. It's just the system pointing at itself and negating these dynamics. So specific to the piece downstairs, you may have noticed it looks very kind of haphazard the way the mics and speakers are placed, but you can't really see in this picture. Each microphone is pointing at a speaker, sometimes at a very short distance, sometimes across the gallery space. And basically each pair of microphones and speakers that are pointing at one another creates feedback in some way. Now, there was a discussion of, sorry, I forget your name, but like, is this feedback? Why isn't it getting very loud, or why is it so tonal and pretty at points? I'm using a that's that guy there. No, that was me responding to. So I'm using feedback, but in a way that's highly regulated. I'm using a computer software that I designed to basically to allow the room to listen to itself, to allow each microphone to listen to its own signal through its the speaker that's pointing at it. And so I'm using relatively simple devices to only allow certain frequencies to feedback, and to regulate the volume of that of the resulting feedback. So basically, it's as if there's somebody turning up the volume knob, listening to feedback begin. You stop turning the volume knob up, and then the feedback continues on its own, right? Until it reaches a certain level where you say this is too loud, and you start turning down the volume. And you're just trying to reach some sort of static state. So that's all that's really happening, is just happening through computer software. So you're able to do things that you wouldn't be able to do by hand. But it's definitely identical in principle to a sound person tuning a room for a speech and finding the resonant frequencies with a third octave EQ and adjusting it. It's just doing the inverse. It's coaxing that out. And actually, that's kind of how this idea came to be, as like assisting some guy. And I was like, oh, this is great. You know, I've seen it before, but it was particularly musical at that moment. So I said feedback is this kind of, way in which an amplification system negates its power to communicate in some way. These are all communication systems at the end of the day. It's also a really interesting device for me to work with, because it has this sense of circularity, but also a sense of non-causality to it. You can't really say that the feedback is produced by the microphone or the speaker or the space. It's produced through the relationship of these three items. If you remove one item, the feedback will disappear or it will change, but you can't really point to the source. The source is the network of connections, which I think is a really powerful idea in many spheres of life. And it's particularly poignant for me because that's how I think about listening. Again, if you go back to this idea of listening being distributed throughout, your mental state, the length of your ear canal, your personal history of listening, the acoustic space you're in, the electronic device you're listening through, the connector that was made in China. You know, like all this stuff is affecting your experience of listening. And feedback is this nice parallel of this distributed sound making activity. And in truth, each microphone is listening in a very, very limited way, is listening to itself, listening to the input signal and regulating it based on a variety of musical decisions that I've made. The other thing that's a bit different about this piece, next to a few of the other works I'll show you that use feedback, is that this piece allows visitors to enter into a relationship with the sound-making process. We had a bit of a short discussion about interactive art, Chris and myself, and this is, for me, this is a true interactive piece in the sense that it's not a reactive system. And you don't necessarily grasp the interaction. But what happens is, since the system utilizes the room and the current acoustic situation to try to create a certain level of feedback and continually adjusts it based on the acoustics, when somebody walks into the space, they are changing the acoustic situation. They're absorbing sound and reflecting sound depending on their position in relevance to the microphones and speakers. They're also making sound intentionally. Sometimes they speak into the microphone, or they are talking to their friend, or just walking around. And so the software is always adjusting to these changing acoustic environments. It's always recalibrating itself based on the acoustics of the room. And so the sound production, even when it doesn't seem like you're creating the sound, you're actually an integral part of the process. If you weren't there, that feedback note would not be the same length, would not start up in the same envelope. The only thing is it would be in the same pitch. That's the only thing that you're not directly influencing. There's also another level to the piece beyond the feedback, which is that the microphones are live, so you can talk into them. And what happens is it was hard to tell in the opening because there were a lot of people in the space and talking, etc. But if you're there alone, talk into the different microphones, and you will hear that your sound, the sound of your own speech or whistling or singing is especially nice, is actually coming from another speaker, usually on the other side of the room, or several speakers. The reason for that is partially because people love to talk into microphones, and at first, with some of my earlier feedback pieces, people didn't believe that it was feedback because they couldn't actually hear themselves through the microphone. So that was one level. But also, what's nice is that when somebody speaks into the microphone at the forefront of the picture, the sound, let's say, comes out of the speaker in the very back of the picture. Now remember, that speaker has a microphone pointing at it. So that microphone catches the sound of that speaker and sends it to another speaker, which has a microphone pointing at it, which sends the sound to another speaker, and on and on. And it's actually a physical delay system. So the sound, it's more like a reverberation, a physical reverberation system, where new resonances, acoustic resonances, are introduced to the space based on the kind of speaker it is, the timbral characteristics, the size of it, the position in relevance to other microphones. So there's the one sort of like room resonance that we would just say, like, acoustically this room has, when you sing that note, the room sings, right? But here we have another superimposed layer of resonance, the resonance of the system itself. So if you're there alone and you're talking or whistling or singing into the mic, if you find the resonant frequency, it all of a sudden sort of turns the room into a resonator. It seems like it's a much larger space than it is ordinarily. And in fact, because the mics are live all the time, when somebody is walking on one side of the room, you can hear their footsteps from a speaker on the other side of the room, and you hear the whole room filtered through this network of microphones and speakers through a very particular speaker with its own timbral characteristics. These are all used speakers. At least 3 of them came out of the garbage. So they're reclaimed. They're not high quality speakers. They're just but they each have their own voice. They each have their own character. So you can listen to the room that you're in through the filter of this system, through this particular personality of this particular speaker. Yeah, so I'll show you a video of some other work that uses feedback. Actually, work that predates this piece by a few months. So this was the original show called The Sound of Empty Space. That was me adjusting the volume. That wasn't in the video. So this is a kinetic piece. It creates feedback very much in the same way that a room listening to itself does. Although, of course, you can't interact with it in the same way that I described. So there's a combination of software control. It only allows certain notes to feedback, but the actual feedback is completely physical. It depends on the position of the microphone in relevance to the speakers. So every time the microphone hovers over a speaker, we get a new tone that comes from that particular speaker cone. The inspiration for this was kind of this idea of a ballerina rotating on a music box. And I think, again, this kind of like speaks, oh, there I am. Good, I'm not wearing the same shirt. I did that once in a talk. It was embarrassing. So there's this idea of, again, emphasizing the physical correlation of the microphone and microphone stand as this sort of human-like sort of presence. And in fact, the melody is a borrowed melody. It's a reduction of the main theme from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. The original melody is about 2 minutes long, and because of this rotation is a lot slower, the melody is stretched to about 10 minutes long, so it's about 4 or 5 times the length. So this was actually one of the first pieces that I made in this show. So again, you can see this kind of relationship between the music as text, the idea that I'm referencing something with its own particular history, in relation to this idea of the microphone as a dancer. And it's about creating this, again, this combination, this sort of like something that not only do you hear it and listen to it in the way that we would hear and listen to music, but also that by knowing that it's Tchaikovsky, slowed down, created through feedback, you're now listening to it in a very different way than you would have if you just heard it without seeing it, or just heard it while seeing it without knowing the kind of intertextual reference. So it's these ideas of recursive processes of listening that really interest me, and the idea that our listening develops in time. As you spend more time with a piece, you start listening to it in a different way. If you come back again, or in the case of this show, there were 3 companion pieces, you can't listen to the second piece that you encounter in the same way, because you've already learned something about the process while listening to the first piece. This is actually one of my personal favorites. I think we almost had it here, but it didn't work out. It's called the loudest sound in the room, experienced very quietly. So it's very self-explanatory. It's a PA system with a dB meter inside, with a relay switch that turns on and off every 30 seconds. And basically it's a feedback loop that exceeds 120 decibels, which is the volume at which ear damage occurs. But this feedback loop is contained inside a system of two soundproof acrylic boxes. So you hear it actually slightly quieter than you hear the sound right now. And yet you know that it is approximately the volume of a car horn if you had your ear right to it. So again, it's this kind of dialogue of like you're watching something loud, but you can't hear it loud, but it makes you think of loudness, or it shows that loudness is not just a physical thing. It's something that that has this sort of conceptual dimension to it. It's also, I think, an interesting piece because what you are listening to, if we think about sound making and listening as these distributed processes, what are you listening to? Yeah, sure, microphone, speaker, amplifier, feedback, right? The materiality of all these, components, right? But you're also actually listening to the air between the two aquariums. The air between the two aquariums is the reason that it's so quiet. The acrylic only absorbs so much sound, but dead air is a great insulator. So you're actually listening to something which is thought of as completely passive, and that's integrated into the process of sound making, and in that sense kind of reveals itself in a way that we're not used to. The third piece and last piece in this series is it's called Vessel. So here the feedback uses the resonance of a jar. It's again just a microphone pointing at a speaker. And the movement of the speaker in relation to the microphone catches the different resonant frequencies of this jar in a way not unlike if you play a clarinet, for instance, and you block all the holes, finger holes, you will get a different tone than if you open all of them. Actually, acoustically, it's the exact same idea. And so this piece is actually, you listen to it on headphones. You wouldn't hear this in the room. You're kind of listening to an interior space that you don't have access to in some way. And the feedback is kind of, it illustrates the fact that there is this acoustic identity to this object. If it was a different jar, it would sound differently. We'd get different pitches. So I'm actually going to pause this right there. And stuff that's not feedback, because for me, feedback it's like it's this really interesting material. Obviously, I've been dealing with a lot of feedback this year, but to me, it's kind of like this subset, like it's a specific vocabulary of amplification, which is the larger theme of my work, I guess. This piece is in some way related to a room listening to itself. It's basically an acrylic box. Oh, I'll play videos maybe better. So this is an acrylic box with an amplification system inside it. There's a microphone outside of it. This is people speaking Finnish in the gallery. And so there's a microphone outside the box, which sends the sound into the box and amplifies that sound out of that small speaker. But the box is soundproof, again, so we can't hear that sound. What we hear is there's another microphone inside the box that is amplifying the speaker and resonance of that box and sends it to headphones. This is what it sounds like. And again, there's this absurdity that I find interesting, where you're inside a room and then you're listening to that room compressed into this relatively small box, and then you're re-immersed in it through headphones. But it's the room that you're in at that very moment. And again, there's no electronic processing outside of amplification. The processing is completely acoustic, completely physical. It's just the box itself. And I like this idea of like, people don't really realize that it's the room they're in often until like their friend is talking or something, and it gives this kind of like double layer. You can just listen to the sound, or you can listen to the sound of the room, or the sound of the box, or the sound of the room in the box, or the sound of the room amplified through the box on headphones, depending on your level of awareness. Another piece that I showed in the same show, it's another personal favorite of mine. I guess I really like my own work. I have a lot of favorites. This is a bit different in terms of the materials used. It uses 3 cassette tape players. Cassette tapes were how I grew up with music. And I found this sentence written by, which just flashed on the screen. I apologize, it was a bit fast. The sentence was, the only thing we know about the future is that it's going to be different. And it was written by this business management guru in the States who really pioneered like personnel management in the 70s, how to make people and organizations more efficient. And he wrote this sentence. I didn't really know his work before, but that sentence caught my eye. It was from basically a manual of his techniques that he wrote in 1973. So I collected cassette tape players that were made around that time. These are all late 60s to early 70s portable cassette tape recorders, which were at their time like the height of technological achievement. I mean, when you read the manuals for these, it's hilarious. I mean, it's really like, now you could take your music to the beach, or you can record the sound of the waves in super high fidelity. And of course, it's not high fidelity anymore, but at the time, this was really not only like this amazing achievement, but also like a way of imprinting a certain person's vision of the future in a material object. I really think about this one. I don't know if you can see, but it's actually a joystick that controls the play, rewind, stop, fast forward positions. But you know, somebody thought like in the future it will all be joysticks, and I'm going to get ahead of it, and I'm going to put it on this cassette player. So I find these objects really interesting for that reason. And what I did is I recorded the message, that sentence that this Peter Drucker guy wrote. I recorded with the text-to-speech voice, the Apple text-to-speech voice, which was something not available at that time, and also a bit outdated today.
Only thing.
Pause it for a second. And I recorded it with space between each word, so that the message plays itself correctly between the 3 tape players, between the different loops, and then slowly scrambles itself out of time. So as the message moves into the future, it's continually different. This is what it sounds like.
Another thing. Future is now. It. That is going. And to be different.
So again, there's this kind of interplay between not only the sentence is kind of scrambling itself, but it's also this message can come into the future only through amplification and storage media. But our understanding of it is conditioned by this exact media. Like, we know it's old because we hear the fidelity of the devices. And that sort of thing is, I think, really interesting about any recording device, you know, is that it allows things to move into the future, but in a really dated way. Like you just stamped it with a date as soon as you record it. And of course, whatever it is that you don't like about the technology is exactly what will make you nostalgic for it at some point. You know, if you think about cassettes, the resurgence of cassettes, vinyl, glitch music, I think has kind of a similar idea that these problems then become a vocabulary for artistic exploration. Sorry. Yeah, well, the '90s, but then like if you think about like the 2000s glitch kind of movement, like it's kind of like referencing those glitches that you hated, like the skipping CD player, etc. Right? So again, that's this kind of interplay. No. I'll show you slightly more recent work. Also uses amplification, but in a very different way. And again, I didn't really speak about this so much, but obviously there's a sculptural element to these objects and a way in which people interact with a sculpture that's making sound as opposed to a music system, right? So it does receive some sort of focal point. This is part of what will be a series of works. This is the first one. I want to make a series of curtains. This one really has to do with the idea of white noise. So it's 240 pairs of fake Apple headphones, which are now also outdated because we don't have the jack anymore on the stupid phone. But there's 24 channels of sound. So as you walk along the curtain, you can focus on different elements of it, different rhythmic elements or quasi-tonal elements. And of course, in the distance, it's noisy. It just sounds kind of like like noise. And I think white noise is kind of this interesting concept or material because it's all the frequencies, kind of like parallel to white light. But at the same time, it's this idea of relates to the idea of error, of like no signal. It's almost like too much signal to be signal. It becomes noise, right? But at the same time, this has a very organic kind of sound to it. It kind of sounds like the waves, and white noise is used in sleeping machines and stuff like that. So this is kind of an idea that I'm working and continuing to develop. And of course, the headphone is this device that that allows us to create an interior personal sound bubble, right? And it's even like a do not disturb sign when you like have headphones in the bus. That's like there was an article that it was actually a lot about women. That if they don't want like a strange man to like harass them in the bus, they put headphones in, and then it's like you're like off limits, like don't talk to me kind of thing, even when there's no music playing. So this idea that this device is used to create this bubble, but then by multiplying it and creating this semi-permeable barrier in the gallery physically, is sort of it kind of conditions the sound of the gallery, but also divides it. You already have the two sides of the curtain. You can kind of see through, but it does block it to some degree. So I like this. I mean, I find the headphone like to be a really interesting and timely kind of object, even though I guess I should hurry up because they're going to disappear super soon. Do this one first. This is a piece I did in Finland. The idea was, again, thinking about amplification, especially in public space. And everything I showed is very gallery-based. So I think this is kind of like a nice example of exploring sound outside of the gallery, which is something I'm really interested in. It has its own difficulties, so it doesn't happen quite as often as I would like. But this piece was one attempt. So often we think of amplification in public spaces. It's like a negative. It is a negative. I think of it as a negative if you're in like a metropolis in Asia, like you have advertisements yelling at you in the streets, which thankfully we don't really have that in North America. We used to, but it's no longer legal. But in the beginning, like in bars in New York in like the 1910s and 20s, like that was very common advertising techniques. So there's all these kind of negative connotations of amplification in public space, and I thought, how can I riff off that and create something that's very positive and really and funny, and kind of like funny for people who aren't into sound art, just enjoyable in general. So I recorded the message "I love you" in English and Finnish, myself and a woman I met in Finland. And I blew up a bunch of helium balloons, and I attached this small portable stereo system to it. And then I would just, over a series of a few weeks, I would just release it every few days and fly it around the city, almost like a kite. And eventually I would cut the cord and I would just let it float away. So they were very cheap stereo systems. 3 of them are somewhere outside Western Finland or in the ocean or something like that. And the message just yells out, "I love you," to people who are just walking in the public square. So again, very very low fidelity, but
I love you all very much.
but very it's supposed to be funny, and like I think people really liked it, and it was a really nice project because I actually got to talk to a lot of people in the street. Which is why I chose colorful balloons. I mean, who doesn't like balloons? And people responded to it in such a big way. Like I had a gallery show there, and I'm sure a lot more people saw this piece and actually talked about it than the gallery show. So it was a really nice side project where I just basically walked around flying this thing. Then when I show it in the gallery, I have it floating in the gallery, so people can still kind of understand it a little bit.
I love you.
So I'll show one last piece, which is kind of similar in some ways. It's like, it's colorful. So I'm really mindful of when I'm doing like a solo show. I hate having too many sound pieces in one place. Like I think the way it works in the gallery right now is quite interesting because one piece makes sound and the others are visual but relate to sound in some way. Sometimes you go to a sound art group show and it's noisy. You don't really feel like listening anymore because there's too much sound. So when I'm making like a solo show and there's a few pieces, I always make sure there's one silent piece, like the soundproof aquarium it's nearly silent. And so this is another piece that I made really recently. It's kind of cheeky. It's laser engraved earplugs, which say "listen to yourself" on them. They're functional as earplugs. There's lots of them. There's like 1,200 pairs. And what you do is it's coupled with a list of instructions, which I like to call like an interior sound walk. So I assume most people are familiar with the idea of a sound walk, but if you're not, basically it's as simple as just walking in a city and being attentive to sound. Often this happens in a group. Somebody leads the sound walk, takes you through a few different acoustic spaces, but you're concentrating on listening. And it's a really great experience. I highly recommend it if you haven't done it, whether in an organized way or on your own. But it's about listening to the world around you, to the soundscape. And in this show, it was the same show with the earbuds, and I was thinking a lot about this idea of how to invert objects so they do what they're supposed to do, but that kind of opens up a new dimension. And I thought the earplug literally is meant to block sound. But what happens is when you put it in, you're actually hearing more of yourself, of your own body. And so there's a list of 14 instructions where you put the earplugs in, that's the first instruction, and you take them out, that's the last one. And in between, you're kind of playing, becoming aware of certain sounds that your body is making that you can only hear when your ears are plugged. And sometimes that's like touching your teeth together, or breathing in a particular way, or putting your finger right behind your ear so you can hear your own pulse. And so it's a silent piece. It's a piece you can do at home. You don't need these earplugs. You can use any earplugs, or you can use your fingers. There is a list of instructions on my website if you want to do the performance. And yeah, so again, it's a sound piece. For me, it's a sound piece, but it doesn't make sound in the gallery, and I like that sort of counterpoint between the different pieces that are presented at the same time. So yeah, so that's all I'm gonna say about that. I hope you enjoyed at least some of this.